Dr. Chabra, please take over. This will be the first session will be a presidential guest oration followed by the presidential oration by Dr. Chabra himself. So Dr. Chabra will chair the first session along with Dr. Raghav Dutt. Dr. Chabra, please introduce the guest, please.
Yeah, can you see my slides?
Yeah, yes, we can see.
I saw that now.
Thank you. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Associate Professor Douglas Brown.
Thank you. Thank you.
He has been like my mentor, so it is my pleasure to introduce him. He is the former director of the Victorian Spinal Cord Service, a comprehensive traumatic spinal cord service at Austin Health. He is a graduate of Monash University. He became head of the Spinal Cord Service in 1982. He is the founding director of the Spinal Research Institute, Heidelberg, Victoria, Australia, and currently its executive director. And very importantly, he is the past president of ISCOS from 2012 to 2014, and have had the pleasure and honor of working under him and with him for a very long duration. In 2012, he had been an author or co-author in 84 papers published in various journals and 4 book chapters. This would have been added subsequently. His current research interests are the peripheral organ consequences of spinal cord injury, physical and psychosocial aspects of SCI rehabilitation and community reintegration. He has 40 years experience in the management of spinal cord injury, and recently, very recently, he has been bestowed the honor of the Member of the Order of Australia in the Australia Day 2021 honors list for significant service to medicine, particularly to spinal cord injuries. Hence, it is my proud privilege to be able to introduce my mentor, Professor Douglas Brown, whom I thought would be appropriate to deliver this lecture. Can we play?
My name is Doug Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Spinal Research Institute and previously Director of the Victorian Spinal Cord Service in Melbourne, Australia. We're going to talk today about the translation of spinal cord injury research into clinical practice. As you know, this is a complex and difficult topic and is not well covered, with no real plans or strategies to affect such translation, and we're going to talk about what needs to be done or could be done. Part of the problem is that there is an enormous amount of research that's published every year, and this is just a very unsophisticated login of topics to Google Scholar over 10 years. Some of the papers there are obviously coming up several times, but the slide does give you an indication of the vast amount of publications that there are, and sifting and trying to get the knowledge and whatnot is very difficult because you can't read all those papers in 10 years, even if you divide that by 10. It's a lot of papers, and they're not always relevant to whatever we have an interest in our own clinical practice. So there is such a lot of research, but we'll find the changes in clinical practice are really quite slow. And it's been well reported they take up to 17 years and commonly 9 to 12 years. That's a long time. And by the time you're getting the research into practice, the world has moved on. So it makes it difficult. And it also means that patients aren't getting the advantage of the latest research. So why does it take so long? There are a lot of reasons, and it's a very complex situation. Healthcare and healthcare systems are large and extremely complicated. The healthcare is probably the most complicated industry in the world, certainly one of the most complicated. There are so many, if you like, products in all the diseases, but really the main focus is the patient, and the patient carries every complication, every possibility, every metabolic combination you can imagine. So this size and complexity carries great inertia with it, and that makes change slow. But also healthcare competes at a government level with other governmental priorities for funding. And sometimes they seem to be more important than the healthcare research and the application of that to clinical practice. And the research volume that there is out there doesn't equate to relevance or quality. And so it really is a difficult situation. But clearly in governmental terms, the urgent is going to replace the important because the urgent is within the timeframes they work. The other factors that have an impact are political and personal factors. These definitely influence health priorities and health practice. People are not purely focused on what's the right thing, what's the logical thing, what's the sensible thing. It's difficult to make decisions in complex situations, and the personalities are the ones that really understand and drive change or not. In democratic societies like ours, the public perception of health needs can be very important in influencing government and hospitals about priorities, because they end up then with sometimes what's the biggest problem, as it were, has the most influence. And yet sometimes the more important problem in a strategic sense with terms of economics and that isn't so obvious, it's not so numerous, doesn't get the attention. And the other factor that we need to always remember is that we're moving in societal relationships, and the age of professionals is now replaced by the age of managers. Some people disparagingly call them bean counters, but they are people who look at things from a different perspective with an eye to the cost and trying to get costs down while maintaining standards, rather than costs down by increasing standards of care, which are often more cost effective. The other factor that we need to always be aware is that there is poor public and political education, and therefore the public and the politicians that can't really make good assessments of research outcomes. And that's why it's important that doctors be part of it and professionals be part of it, even though it's the age of the managers. We also need to be aware that there is often very poor presentation of clinical research results, and many of them presented as if there's magic in them and the answer is there, it'll be there tomorrow, when in fact they haven't gone that far, but they need to sound positive in order to get the next grant. There is therefore a very big break in the research continuum. There's the basic research in laboratories and so on, and that needs to be translated into clinical trials. And then when the clinical trials are completed, stage 1, 2, 3, there's an implementation to practice. Now, there are often breaks in that continuum. There are breaks after the first pilot studies when the study doesn't go on to be big enough to become significant. There's a big break when there is a significant result from that moment to putting it into practice. So the research is done, it's published, and the research moves on, but the outcomes may not come into practice. So how many people know of that research, for example? How many have read the paper when it was published? Was it in a journal they read? How many go to the conference where the paper was presented? And there's so many conferences as well, which I didn't mention before. So new knowledge dissemination is quite slow. It may even not go far. It may stop where it starts, in the unit where the technique was developed, but there is no financial incentive to go forward. It may be forgotten and perhaps rediscovered years later. That's quite important, quite common. And the other real thing is, who champions the change? Who champions the new research outcome? And is it someone that's got some influence? It won't go far. So it's fast in the situation where there's commercial input. So drug companies and device companies develop their product. It takes them some time. They do some research going through the clinical trials because they've got the money to do it, and they put the money into the development. And then they have to make sure that that outcome, which is good or looks good, makes a profit. So that means they must sell whatever they've produced. And therefore they put money into marketing and education about the product. And therefore the implication can be speeded to 3 to 5 years. And we know that the markets that are most profitable get the most marketing and education. So that means that that group of commercial interest research has a relatively fast translation into practice. When the knowledge is translated fast, it's where clinicians learn the techniques with all the nuances so they can be confident in practice. That's where the marketing and education comes in. When they know how to use the new device, when clinicians know how to use the treatment appropriate to their practice, and when there is a reputable clinician championing the implementation. Most people come on board if someone they trust and believe knows what they're talking about and is experienced, says this is the way to go. So non-commercial research, on the other hand, even if it looks significant, may not even get past the pilot stage. Funding is very discontinuous, and funding of researchers in the more public sector is you have to have the results to get the next grant. So if you're doing the study, you haven't got the results to apply for the next grant, then you're writing them up, but you haven't got a grant, you've run out of money. So it's a very big problem. Laboratory research often doesn't go to clinical trial, and pilot studies therefore don't go through to the definitive 3 stages of clinical trials. Even when there is a statistically significant outcome, there is no committed funding for knowledge dissemination and implementation into clinical practice. This is really what slows down the translation of non-commercial research into practice. The things that will change this is what we need to be focusing on a little bit. The studies where there is a health and an economic benefit are the ones that are able to attract implementation support, knowledge translation from that result into practice. The economic result attracts people's attention. Health research that doesn't show benefits economically, only clinically, has a much bigger problem in getting implementation. And that often requires support outside the medical profession. So support from consumers and users, media support, and personal interest of someone who has the power to champion the change and gain priority with the funders. Researchers therefore get the best results in this area when they are allied with consumers. It's consumers who understand the research, and such an alliance can therefore be successful in making change happening, enforcing change, because funders listen to their constituents. What's going to change the current situation? That collaboration, that alliance of researchers, consumers, clinicians, and funders creates an understanding of common goals and benefits. And that, everyone then owns the change. And that can enable a more rapid rollout of the research outcomes to clinical practice. The implementation is quicker when all the stakeholders are winners and then the community benefits. There are other barriers that need to be overcome. It's not just as simple as that, of course. Clinicians may be very comfortable and satisfied with what they're doing now, and really to make the change can be difficult. Change is often resisted. People often have to have a stick as well as a carrot to change. People often are not, they're too busy to take on a new challenge. You know the sort of situation I'm talking about. There's a comfort in following what someone else has trailblazed, what the leader's done in the field, and then you follow on. And if there's any difficulties, they're dealing with them, you're just a follower. And a number of clinicians can't afford, particularly with the devices or surgical techniques, can't afford to leave their private practice, because then when they're not providing the service, the practice tends to shrink. And so they can't spend much time learning new techniques and treatments. The other one is that the hospitals and the healthcare systems may not provide the funding or the leave to enable people to go and learn new skills. Therefore, the information about the commercial advantages may not be well known and the economic advantages, I mean, and therefore they're not convincing. And that's hard to get people to understand things that are not presented in language they understand, in a context they understand, and in a way where they see that they can be part of the outcome. So the dissemination barrier, there are many publications. How does one keep up with the number of papers, and how does one know which is the best and which one will last? Well, that should be last, not latest. Who can see what will last and what will not progress? And what are the benefits that people have to find out about? And no one has the time to read all this. There is a need to bring research to clinical practice. Who else needs the training besides the medical practitioner? Do you need to have a team? Do you need to train nurses or physios and other people? The team concept is often not well understood or practiced, particularly in surgical areas. Becoming better, as you know. But who has the responsibility also for the change, and where is the money coming from to finance the dissemination process and the training? So shortening the knowledge translation time is a joint responsibility. Clinicians are probably the most important people in that. So they have to take charge personally. They really understand it best. They're the best trained. They have the best understanding of how it will work. Consumers can drive the change because they have influence with funders, and the health policy makers must approve the change, and they can be persuaded not so much or not only by science, but by the consumer pressure. So we also need to have health boards and government health departments involved and committed in order to fund it. And we must also make sure the hospitals are adapted and ready for change, ready to change their systems to allow new treatments to become the standard. There are some issues, but with working together, the stakeholders can move quite quickly to implement and adopt new non-commercial advances in medical research. They can do it as quickly as commercial companies. These ones we're talking about, these orphan device discoveries, are usually small in number of people using them, or in areas where there isn't the perception of importance. But often dealing with things other than cancer, for example, hip replacements, as you all know, can make people very functional, but cancer would get the money often instead of the hip replacements. We all know that. So we need to look, if 17 years for implementation from outcome to practice is too long, is 3 years too short? Well, there's the cost of doing business, which it comes about because the trial period, even for commercial companies, is quite short. You're looking at 1 year results, very rarely 3. And the longer term results are after it's been used for some time around the world, or on a large scale. And the complication rates and so on become apparent, the longer term ones. And we know of examples where that has led to a device being taken off the market with those chromium hips, and drugs where the anti-inflammatory action has cardiac complications years later. And COVID vaccines are an example of this. They're very extreme. They're coming into play very early, and they certainly haven't got any long-term efficacy effects and complication rates known. So that will become apparent, and that's a cost of doing business. It's the complications, the compensation and so on. That's something that's built into the business model of commercial companies. They expect failures and returns and breakdowns and unknown complications, and they have the compensation is modeled into their economics of the device or the drug. But the return on investment for them must outweigh the cost of the complications, and sometimes that means that something that is beneficial doesn't go ahead because of the possibility that there might be problems and the market is too small. The risks of rapid implementation for the non-commercial ones is that much may not go ahead at all. It may be that clinicians and researchers risk their own reputations and that because they believe in the drug. risky, of course. And the best option is to have it taken up by a commercial entity. So we are therefore in a position of what is the best, how fast should translation to clinical practice be from a result that looks like it's working. And so I think it would be reasonable to think that 3 to 5 years would be a kind of compromise that we should be looking at for good rapid implementation. So the future, to have a short implementation time, commercial drugs and devices, they will cover the cost of compensation if there are complications, disasters, and it's withdrawn from the market. But increasingly, regulators, clinicians, and funders will also be sued because they will be, there is a legal spreading the blame kind of thing. If you don't get it from one, you might get it from the other. And that's why medical defense and all these things are part of it. And it's going to become more common that if clinicians are using drugs and devices that only have a 3-year or whatever trial period, they may find that they'll get off because they haven't done any harm, or they haven't done anything intentionally, but they will still be troubled greatly. And sometimes, if they've been promoting the device for the drug company or the device company, they will be implicated with that commercial company. So in the shorter time frame for the non-common, non-commercial or orphan devices and drugs, that's an interesting area too. This now is the age, not so much of the managers, but also now the common person. The common man now has a bigger say. And you in India know very well how that has played out in recent times with farmers in Delhi. People can have really big impacts politically. And that's going to have an impact on how complications are dealt with. So this will lead to more actions against clinicians, as well as regulators, universities, hospitals, and companies. This is something that we all need to be very aware of. So how should the clinician prepare for this? Because it's happening. So every drug device and every drug and device that is used, that's come on the market in the last few years, and you're starting to use it, you must keep very careful clinical notes because we know that if it's been around less than 10 years, it might be that 5, 6, 7, 8 years, the complication will suddenly, people start to count them up and find that it's been quite common. People have been ignoring it. That won't be acceptable. Clinicians must feel that all drugs and all devices that are less than 10 years in use are in a sort of phase 4 trial, and that they're the clinicians participating in that trial. Very important to keep your notes up to date. Very important to highlight complications. Also, any other diseases or complications that your patients get, because that's how the cardiac complications of some drugs have come up, not because the drug has been targeted at the heart or the cardiovascular system, but because there's been increased incidence of strokes or heart attacks. So it's very important to make a note of that for each of your patients and see how that goes, and even to be able to present some of those at results at clinical meetings. So the other factor, of course, it's absolutely important that any complication that might remotely be related, remotely even, needs to be reported, because that's when the data can be assembled to see if there appears to be any association. So it's important in this age where the people are so much better educated, have so much more social mobility, social connection, and so on, that they be active stakeholders in the implementation of all new drugs and devices. So it's important for clinicians to acknowledge that their patients are really partners in this phase 4 drug trial as you prescribe treatment and undertake surgery to install devices. It won't be good enough to have tokenism. I've discussed it with the patient. I've told him that the patient has to be really very much part of the process. They need education, and not just for one particular device or drug, but really it should be part of the system. So therefore, the clinicians have to accept their leadership role as a serious responsibility in the implementation in the period of up to 10 years from the time the drug or device hits the market. They are actually, and you are actually, the key people in how that drug is translated into practice, and whether it stays, whether it is its place is defined, will only come with time. The short-term phase 3 trials are not going to give us the longer-term outcomes.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas Brown. That was a wonderful presentation. I think, can I request you to brief all the participants about the activities of Spinal Research Institute, what you are doing to promote research, and what would your tips be to young clinicians and young spine surgeons on how they could incorporate research in their day-to-day activities?
Thank you. This is a big question. The Spinal Research Institute recognises that a lot of research that has outcomes that look promising aren't being implemented very quickly because the mechanisms for dissemination of information about the device or the drug are so poor. And so its role is to try and develop collaborations between people, networks around the world that will bring information to people's attention, even when they don't go to the conference or read the paper. And that's its major focus, particularly focusing on younger clinicians and younger researchers, and also looking to help the consumers, the people the patients, understand what their role can be. Because I think it's very important in the future that we work together to get the answers. Being researchers in a little academic bubble where we don't talk to other people, we don't share information, creates a situation where when the research is done, there is no outreach that is really developed. So networks, I think, are very important. The Spinal Research Institute is very keen to develop networks of people with common interests. And that in spinal cord injury, that involves people from all disciplines of medicine. Surgeons, critical in the acute phase, because the management of the vertebral column is also the management of the cord. And later situations where non-trauma, where people have stenoses and tumours and that, management of the vertebral column is management of the cord. So spinal surgeons are actually critical spinal cord surgeons. And the structure of the vertebral column, the mechanics, is really only part of the surgeon's job. So he needs to be involved with people working in spinal cord injury to work together with them so that we get the best outcomes. It's really, we don't want the situation of, the surgery was a success, but the patient didn't benefit. We really want to have the very best possible outcome. So working together is very important. In spinal cord injury, this also, in the chronic sense, involves physicians in respiratory medicine, cardiology, and involves urologists, plastic surgeons, etc. But in terms of us today, it's really the vertebral column surgeons are looking after they're neurosurgeons as well, if you like. They're looking after the cord. The neurology of the cord is really what it's about. The vertebral column is to protect the cord and to provide the strength and the flexibility for the cord. So I think we're really very keen to develop collaborations. We're particularly keen to bring young researchers into contact with young researchers, to bring clinicians in contact with researchers, people with spinal cord injury and their carers and loved ones in contact with researchers, so that for the future, not just the people with spinal cord injury today, but the people who will have accidents, who will have tumours, will have stenoses and so on, will also get the very best outcomes And so anyone who's prepared to work with us on that is very welcome. We're the Spinal Cord Research Hub, Spinal Cord Research Hub, SCORH, is there for everyone to use to form groups, to form collaborations, to develop protocols in the wider collaborative sense, and to come forward with multi-center studies to give us outcomes that really change things with a lot of power behind that, because they'll have the outcome, we'll have the consumers who are there, who are going to benefit and see the benefit and have the power, and the clinicians in that who will implement it, and then we can really influence funders for the implementation of change that will benefit everyone. Health economics are important because whatever way you do it, if you're going to cost a lot of money, you'll be put aside a bit unless there's clear political gain. If it's so getting the outcomes that are going to be beneficial, and almost all advances are actually beneficial because they're more efficient. And people go back to work, people pay taxes, or they stay in hospitals less and all that. So even if the actual treatment seems more expensive, the longer term, the bigger picture is cost effective. So health economics, and that's one of the things we'd really like to promote. We'd be very happy to have people work with us in doing that.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Srivastava or Dr. Raghav, any?
Yeah, I think Dr. Chabra, this is one of the, thank you, Dr. Chabra. And, this is one of the very interesting presidential orations, and it's very important for youngsters what Doug Brown is saying, that we need to take every research with a pinch of salt, especially for youngsters, not to get carried away with developments, and especially the spinal cord injury, which is not in the, in the first, it's somewhat neglected, or it's in the background of the doctors, spine surgeons' minds. Should, they should start taking active interest in this. And you've been an active campaigner for this in India. And I thank you for this excellent presidential oration. Really, I think we should get into this spine research hub, see what's happening, the youngsters. And of course, pioneers like you in India, they should collaborate and get information from you how to proceed in this direction as well, which I think is somewhat neglected or in the background of the average spine surgeon's mind. Thank you, Dr. Chabra, for this excellent presidential oration, guest oration, I should say.
I would also like to congratulate Dr. Chabra for getting Dr. Brown to give this oration, full of wisdom and full of application for youngsters. And thank you, Dr. Brown. We will be all very interested in the spinal cord hub research. There are a lot of us who are doing some research on this, and it will be great to have your guidance and collaboration on this. Thank you, Chabra, for getting Dr. Brown.
Thank you, sir. VTI sir is not there. I think we are running out of time. But I would want to once again thank Dr. Douglas Brown for this wonderful presentation. And we will look forward to your continued guidance on how to carry spinal cord injury research further in this subcontinent. And of course, we will spread information about the work that you have been doing amongst all members. We have a small token ceremony to present the Oration Award to you. Of course, we can't present you in person. It will reach you soon, but there is a small ceremony, and please feel free to continue with listening to what would be on somewhat similar lines, the talk that I give subsequently. Thank you, sir. Please.
Thank you very much.
Ceremony, please.
Sushil, please play the video.
I'm the Executive Director of the Spinal Research Institute. The Institute is dependent upon volunteers for its successful operation, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank them.
So it's on its way and we'll be reaching you soon, the oration memento. Thank you once again for sparing time to be with us, to encourage especially the young members of the society, and we'll carry your word across to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
all.
much.
Yeah. Thank you all for such a wonderful session. Thank you, Dr. Douglas Brown. It was such a eye-opening lecture.